Dan Newman. I'm class of 1991. I live in Berkeley here, and although I grew up on the East Coast, I've lived out in California almost since I graduated Brown, so quite a while. And about 15 years ago, I started a nonprofit called Map Light, and it's a national nonprofit that exposes money's influence on politics to promote political reform. And through my work over the years in passing political reforms, I've met a lot of other people doing the same thing. And I realize that the way most of us hear about democracy issues is pretty gloom and doom, like whether it's in the news media or a book, it's like, here are all the problems. And there's really not much coverage of the solutions, even though I've met many people around the country who are actually promoting solutions and being successful. And so I wrote this book, a book that I would want to read. It's a comic book. It's a 250-page nonfiction graphic novel, and it's fun and interesting and inspiring, and it has stories of people who are bringing change about. And it's a book that when you read it, it leaves you with more clarity about what's going on in this crazy country, and understand some of the deeper forces that underlie it, and what the path forward is. So I'll read a few stories from the book here. All right, so here's me in a cartoon format on the screen. And this is the introduction to the book. Hi, I'm Dan Newman. When I was growing up, I learned that democracy here in America is about government by and for the people. Everyone's voice is supposed to matter, and our elected leaders are supposed to act to help everyone. But over time, I noticed that's not how it works in practice. Say you want to help solve the childhood obesity crisis. A law adding fresh fruit to school breakfast was proposed in California to do just that. But there was a problem. Food processing companies don't earn money from fresh fruit, only canned and processed fruit. Through their influence, the language in the law was changed from fresh fruit to nutritious fruit. Looking behind the scenes reveals that the food processing industry gave more than $1 million to the campaigns of more than 200 state lawmakers in the years before the vote. And taxpayer money intended for fresh fruit was instead used to serve kids canned fruit in sugar syrup, just so that food processing companies can make more money. This kind of corruption is happening on an industrial scale, affecting every aspect of our lives, from the air we breathe, to the schools our kids attend, to whether we can afford to see a doctor or buy a home. Why are food processing companies and big banks, oil companies, drug manufacturers, and every other wealthy industry allowed to bribe politicians like this? Why are they allowed to give money and receive favors in return? It's unjust, and it's the opposite of how democracy is supposed to work. Instead of government by and for the people, it's government by and for the corporations and billionaires. Yet it's allowed, it's legal, according to the rules. The rules I'm talking about determine who controls government. These are the rules of political power, like who can run for office, who can give money to a candidate, how votes are counted, so on. And by the way, all the art in this book is done by my talented partner on this book, George O'Connor, who's a New York Times best-selling illustrator of many graphic novels. So now I'll tell you a story about a candidate who ran for Congress, and this is a true story. This is Paul Perry. Like the other people whose stories appear in this book, he's a real person. Paul decided to run for Congress. On paper, I was an ideal candidate for the Democrats, says Paul. Born and raised in my Philadelphia district, a successful career in education and nonprofit work, Ivy League graduate, young, Black, with gay parents, and therefore a compelling family story. Public service was my life's work. I was tired of seeing kids and families not get the support they deserve from our government. I wanted to help people like Geraldine, a soft-spoken woman with cancer. Geraldine was worried about schemes to upend Obamacare, since she depended on it to stay alive and get her medications. I'll never forget the way her face lit up when I told her I'd fight for affordable, universal health care if elected. The process of actually running for office was a puzzle, even though I had a political science degree. As a new candidate, you're in the wilderness. I asked for advice from the people I was told are the gatekeepers to power in my district, like Democratic Party endorsers and progressive groups who say, money is money. We need a candidate who can raise a lot of it so we can win. Or you share our values, but we're going to hold off on endorsing you. We're waiting on the fundraising numbers. I wasn't naive. I knew it was about fundraising. It was the depth and scope and overwhelmingness of it that got to me. You wake up at 8 a.m., your finance director shows up. You spend most of the day calling people to ask them for money every day. If you're lucky, you get out to evening events. So much of it is just tied to the numbers. The first official communication I received from the National Democratic Party said essentially, welcome to the race. Now raise $200,000 in the next 2 weeks. In other words, we don't care who you are, just show us the money. Support from the party is important, and how much money you raise is about the only way they evaluate you. I wanted to be elected so that I could affect change, but the process was debilitating. I saw myself becoming less of an attentive son, less of a good partner to my girlfriend, and less of a good friend. I found myself thinking about my friends as dollar signs and opportunities and angles. I didn't like the person the constant fundraising was turning me into. When most people run for Congress, their friends and family pony up $1,000 checks. My friends can't afford that. They're teachers and social workers. I'm a millennial with more than $200,000 in student loan debt. Meanwhile, I was running against a lobbyist tapped into the deepest pockets in Harrisburg and DC, and a state senator married to a millionaire. If I was going to raise more, I needed to expand outside my friends and family network into the stratosphere of big donors. I'd gotten a taste of what this was like. At a high-powered fundraising event for a nearby member of Congress, I worked the room, swatting away consultants looking for contracts, absorbing cheap shots from white-haired trial lawyers who scoffed at my youthful candidacy, always seeking out the fattest wallets in the room. I did not feel like I was making real change. I was spending my days shaking down rich people for money. It seemed like the only way to compete. About 6 months in, we were badly outraised. My lead opponent had raised $400,000. I had raised $90,000, and that was hustling, doing everything I could. I decided to leave the race. It was so early in the race, too. It's dispiriting and disheartening how power and influence really works. To win, you need the currency of power. There's actual currency, and there's also connections and networks of influence and spheres of control. I spent a lot of my days positioning myself for what powerful people were willing to do for me and with me. The process maps so directly onto the economic and class privilege in our society, and in many cases, racial privilege. It shapes candidates, even progressives like me, into becoming the types of politicians we should be fighting against. The time spent courting donors disconnects you from voters by design. I came to realize that when we let wealth and connections drive who gets elected, we get the dismal politics we now awaken to every morning. I ran for Congress to help people who need support the most, but the system points you to pay attention to the people who don't deserve as much of your attention. The people who need you the least have the most influence over you just because of the way the system is structured. That's the deepest, saddest irony. But it doesn't have to be that way. Next section, democracy vouchers. Paul Perry found that running for Congress forces candidates to focus on the people funding their campaigns. In most elections, that means people with fat wallets. But what if campaign money came from the community instead? Welcome to Seattle and meet Teresa Mosqueda, a third-generation Mexican-American and daughter of educators and activists. Teresa grew up in the Pacific Northwest, and you can see Bigfoot here in the background. This is definitely the only book on democracy ever to feature Bigfoot. As a leader in the Washington state labor movement and a public health advocate, Teresa helped raise the state minimum wage and pass paid sick leave, and led a program to make sure every child in Washington could receive health care. We've covered 96% of the kiddos in our state, she says. At age 36, she decided to run for city council. As a renter with student debt and a young woman of color, she was not a traditional candidate. She had lots of community support, but not much financial backing. Instead of spending her days calling wealthy people for large donations, she knocked on doors and talked with voters. We need affordable housing and affordable childcare. She raised $300,000, many times the conversations ended with voters giving Teresa $100 in democracy vouchers. She raised $300,000 in democracy vouchers to power her campaign, and she went on to win her election without becoming beholden to corporations and the rich. Now, wait a minute, what's a democracy voucher? In 2015, Seattle voters passed a ballot measure that gives every city resident $100 they can use to support candidates for city council, mayor, and other city offices. Each election season, these democracy vouchers are mailed to voters. Seattleites can give vouchers to the candidates of their choice. Candidates trade in the vouchers to the city for money to run their campaigns. Before Seattle started the Democracy Vouchers program, the city's political donors were not representative of the city as a whole. As shown in this report from the Sightline Institute, who funds Seattle's political candidates, rich white people with view homes, which they proved with data. In 2017, when the Democracy Vouchers program first rolled out, Seattle residents from all across the city gave $80,000 vouchers, gave 80,000 vouchers to candidates. That first year, Seattle residents could use vouchers in Teresa's city council race and some other races, but not in the race for mayor, although vouchers will be allowed in future elections for mayor. So that difference provided an opportunity to measure the difference between contests with vouchers and contests without. So on the left, you can see the donors to the mayor's race with no vouchers, and on the right, contributions from voucher donors. The voucher donors were more numerous, more geographically diverse, and better match the city's population overall. Everyday people can now provide major funding to candidates. Now I can afford to contribute to the candidates I like. Big money has always participated. Now we can participate too. And candidates can now focus their attention on representing all the people instead of just the rich people. Teresa had been asked to run for office before, but money was a huge barrier. I'm still paying off my student loan, she said. Democracy vouchers broke down that barrier. Teresa became the youngest member and the only renter on the Seattle City Council, where she works to lift up the voices of workers, women, and people of color so that every voice matters in our democracy. Now, when I was working on this book, I thought, who are the enemies of democracy? Who is out there, the forces that all of us who want government to represent the people are fighting against? And there's this answer to this question. And in the book, I call it the wealth hoarders. As we work to unrig the rules so our country works for everyone, it helps to know who's working to rig these rules so that our country serves only the very wealthy. A small group of extremist billionaires has been working for more than a half century to change our country to their liking in a way that will hollow out our democracy. They want to turn the US into a fiefdom, where the very wealthy make the laws and control the government. They want to eliminate public schools, minimum wage laws, Social Security, the EPA, all income taxes, and all forms of government assistance to those who need help, and much more. Sometimes this group of billionaires is referred to as the radical right. They are indeed radical, but this phrase doesn't fully capture what they're seeking to accomplish. Instead, I call them the wealth hoarders. Over many years, they've devoted billions of dollars to hundreds of organizations and thousands of political candidates, all towards these ends, and they are winning. So the ideology of the wealth hoarders. Rich people don't need government. Instead of public schools, they can afford private schools. Instead of public parks, they have their own estates. They can pay for private security controls and private healthcare, and they don't rely on Social Security. They all the retirement money that they need. Most rich people, though, like the rest of us, understand that taxes are part of the price of living in a civilized society. Taxes allow the government to accomplish what is needed for Americans as a whole. Taxes pay for public education so that all children have a better chance to achieve their potential. They pay for Social Security, which dramatically reduces poverty. They pay for regulations on commerce, which help prevent companies from exploiting workers and creating monopolies. Other regulations block factories from poisoning the air and Wall Street banks from wrecking the economy. We all pay something so that we have a collective benefit, a society that works better than it would if everyone fended for themselves. The wealth hoarders, though, think differently. Everyone is out for themselves. I've already got mine. Why should I pay taxes to help anyone else? And I'm skipping ahead in the book a little bit. And here's the agenda that follows from that ideology. The wealth hoarders' agenda for the country follows from their ideology. Their agenda: tear government out at the root. That's Charles Koch, who's one of the leaders of the wealth hoarder network that I call him, also known as the Koch political network. They spelled it out in detail in 1980 when the Kochs supported the Libertarian Party presidential candidate, Ed Clark, who was running against Ronald Reagan, thinking Reagan is too liberal. They made David Koch the vice presidential candidate so he could avoid campaign finance limits and spend unlimited money on the campaign. David provided nearly 60% of the campaign's budget. The Libertarian published presidential platform, if implemented, would wipe out government as we know it. It would abolish public schools and required education of kids, minimum wage and child labor laws, abolish Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, all campaign finance laws, the EPA, SEC, and FDA, the FBI and CIA, eliminate all income, corporate, and capital gains taxes, all prosecution of tax evaders, and all forms of welfare for low-income people. The result on election day, just 1% of the vote. In 1980, most Americans despised the wealth hoarders' aims as they still do today. Still, Charles and David Koch kept at it, seeking ways to make their deeply unpopular vision a reality. They found the answers in the work of Buchanan, who sought similar ends. Buchanan saw that in a modern, inclusive democracy, the wealth hoarders' unpopular ideas would always lose. So Buchanan developed and promoted strategies to cripple and bind democracy, to stop it from reflecting the interest of the majority of the people. In the words of Buchanan, we must remove the sacrosanct status assigned to majority rule. Buchanan saw that individual politicians come and go, but the rules of elections and government are what determine over time which interests win. As he was fond of saying, the problems of our times require attention to the rules rather than the rulers. Buchanan dreamed of a government barred by constitutional law from offering social programs or regulating business and wealth, even when most people want those things. A government unresponsive to the majority, instead privileging the interests of the wealthy few. The Kochs put these strategies into action in a phenomenon never before seen in history. A small group of billionaires has organized and funded a comprehensive long-term assault on American democracy that continues today. And I'll leave you with a last story of some of the many people fighting back. Uncoke my campus. For every paid wealth hoarder minion, there's someone out there standing up to them, like Samantha Parsons. As an 18-year-old college freshman in 2012, Samantha heard an odd story about the professor in a friend's economics class. Here's your textbook. If you want to debate climate change, leave and don't come back. Samantha and other students soon discovered that the economics program at their school, George Mason University in Virginia, was heavily funded by the Kochs. They started asking questions, wondering if the Koch funds were influencing what students were being taught. They met with faculty who were also concerned and had been bravely speaking out. Are we a university that can be sold to the highest bidder? The faculty and students pressed the school administration for copies of gift agreements from big donors, but were stonewalled. The students found volunteer legal help and sued the university under Freedom of Information laws. The university was forced to release gift agreements that were previously hidden, generating national headlines like what Charles Koch and other donors to George Mason University got for their money. The gift agreements revealed the ugly truth. The Kochs had helped choose faculty members and biased what was taught for decades. The point of the university is to serve students. I trusted GMU to look out for our education. I feel betrayed. While advocating for transparency at GMU, Samantha helped start Uncoke My Campus, a group supporting activists in exposing and ending Koch influence nationwide. And in 2019, GMU changed its policies so that all future gift agreements would be made public, one of a string of transparency victories at campuses nationwide. I'll note that the Kochs have funded hundreds of college courses and programs at universities, including Brown, libertarian programs. And this is also described in my book. part of a program to indoctrinate students and into this very extreme libertarian view, so that the universities will graduate enough staff to fill the many different think tanks and political institutions that these people favor. So I'll stop there and welcome comments, questions, and thoughts. There's obviously a lot going on in democracy right now, even as we speak. You may recognize this idea of, is rule by the majority really what we have in the US? And so the people attacking that, and I'd welcome comments and thoughts that people have.
Yeah, I'd love to ask how the book's been received. So you have a lot of calls to action in here, very specific calls to action. And I'm wondering if you see evidence that people are acting on that and taking action.
Yeah, I'm get a lot of great response from people who say, I bought multiple copies. I read it and I bought other copies to give to my friends and family because it made a light bulb go on for them. And that was certainly in researching this book, like the wealth hoarder section really is based on these two terrific books, Democracy in Chains by Nancy MacLean and Dark Money by Jane Mayer, which tell the story that I tell here in comics, that it explains so much of the things that seem confusing, like why are there such attacks on government? Why are so many elected officials unwilling to compromise? And it's really part of an agenda to prevent government from functioning. So I've got really feedback on that that's sort of very eye-opening to people, and people that find the book just inspiring in terms of going beneath the surface of what you read in the headlines and showing the underlying dynamics that are driving it.
Yeah, it's really, I have to commend your illustrator for the way that this book was storyboarded, and it's a real talent to be able to crystallize an idea into a single pane and get that pane across and carry it through. Was that process of working with him, did that take a long time to actually make the book concrete that way?
It took some practice by me. I'm used to writing more traditional like articles, prose form, and this is really more like writing a script. And the word count is really at a premium. So I instead of 3 examples like you might find in a regular book, there's just one best example, and then the sentence is 20 words. Like if it's 18 words, that's even better because we're trying to make as much room for the pictures as possible while communicating what's needed. And that was actually a pleasure for me to have the opportunity to write and refine and refine and refine and refine and come up with something really polished. Like a lot of writing doesn't really support that, but because this demanded it, it was a fun experience for me. And the result is something that that I felt really happy about because it's been every sentence in the book, me and many other people scrutinized it a lot.
Yeah, it's really incredible.
Yeah.
The other question I had, just in terms of the content, I think, you know, I'm really glad you started the book with democracy vouchers, because right away it shows you that there is a tangible thing an individual can do, because when you're throwing all these major concepts at us that can just seem overwhelming to you know, combat against, something just singular like that is really helpful. I know at the end of the book, you mentioned that one of the main things, main takeaways would be, if you're interested in creating a better democracy for our country, to join a group that shares a similar thought process about that, your particular issue. But with COVID right now, do you have any type of you know, takeaways or solutions that one can do in our current landscape and still try and achieve what we need to achieve?
I do, and in the book, like I do agree that joining a group is the best way to do things. That the Democracy Vouchers program in Seattle, the events that led to the creation of that was 10 people getting together and say, we want to make this happen in Seattle, and it took them several years, and it took them some work and some successes and failures along the way. But that's just 10 people. I mean, in Berkeley, California, I led the campaign to pass public funding of elections here in Berkeley, which passed in 2016. Originally, I failed when I first started back 12 years ago. It turned out that it often takes some failures on the road to building a big enough coalition to win. And that campaign was started with just myself and one other person. And so there's lots of examples of that. Katie Fahey in Michigan in 2016 was despairing as Hillary Clinton lost the presidential election. But instead of just being despairing, she posted, she put a post on Facebook. I want to do something about gerrymandering in Michigan. Who wants to help me? And this post resonated with people across the political spectrum, led to tens of thousands of volunteers collecting signatures to that ultimately passed in 2018 on a ballot measure and ended gerrymandering in Michigan. So there's so many stories like that. They don't necessarily make the news by its nature. The news is only going to tell us problems most of the time, but there's so much that's possible. I think to your question, Lisa, about what can people do in this time of COVID, it's important to find a group that you can meet people face to face. Obviously, we can't literally meet face to face, but meet on Zoom. If you are just on social media or by email, is simply not enough really to sustain the kind of connection and trust that is built when you're working on a shared project with someone else. Getting involved with a group that works at the state level. So if you're out here in California, if you're in San Francisco or elsewhere in the Bay Area, we're really blessed in the Bay Area that there are lots of civically active people who are organized in groups. And so you can connect to something that is going on in your city. In the Bay Area here, I'm part of a group that's working on trying to get democracy vouchers in Oakland in a couple years. And there's been MapLight, my organization has done work. I know Deirdre's from Palo Alto, we've done reports on Mountain View, San Jose, and money and influence there. If you want to drop me a note, I can connect you with some groups, or the book's website, unrigbook.com, has more. But that's the antidote to this this seemingly overwhelming, despairing, these large national forces. It's like you get involved in your city, the state, you can really push things forward. And that's how things change in America, they bubble up.
Do you feel like people might get or might have gotten confused about the wealth hoarder concept when you have people like Bloomberg and LeBron James paying off all the fines of ex-felons in Florida? So that they're seeing the opposite, that people with enormous wealth can do good.
Yeah.
Question is clear, but whether it's confusing to let both messages sink in.
So I think it's important, and I made a big effort in the book to characterize people according to their beliefs and their actions. So as I point out in the book, most rich people agree that paying taxes is part of living in a civilized society, right? But there are 700 millionaires and billionaires that are part of the Koch network that don't think that. Now that's a really tiny number of people, and I seek to recognize, that's different.
I'm curious about the measure you put through in Berkeley for similar sort of thing of public funding, because I think there's actually a California law which passed by initiative that prohibits that. And I wonder whether you've had to deal with that. Prop 73.
Yeah, so this measure that Stuart is referring to was a sham reform measure that really made democracy, money in politics worse in California, that prohibits the state from spending money on public funding of campaigns. However, cities, charter cities in California, which almost all of the largest cities in California are charter cities, and any city in California can become a charter city just by opting into it on the ballot, in a ballot measure. Charter cities can have no such restrictions. So the funds for Berkeley come from Berkeley. The funds for the Berkeley program come from Berkeley city funds, and then that's why that's legal. In order to get public funding for the state, there will need to be a ballot measure that either implements the public funding system or that at least overturns that restriction so it can be passed through the legislature.
I think it's still a challenge given the financial situation a lot of cities are in right now to try and get something let through, but it's worth trying.
I think that I think it is worth trying. I think that the amount of money these programs cost is tiny. It's really not significant in the context of a city budget. I mean, you just had people in California, I believe the stem cell measure passed this month, is that right? So, you know, people of California, you know, I don't know that people were thinking it's like, oh, well, let's look at the state budget and is this where we want to spend the money? It's like people think, okay, I want to support stem cell research and I'm going to vote for this. And like, I don't know that, you know, in my experience, the lack of money or perceived lack of money is not the dominant thing that makes these different tax measures and programs pass or not. It's really in Berkeley and other places, it's about, do people perceive a problem, lack of access to office unless you have wealth, special interest, influence in the process. That seems to be what drives the change and the campaigns. And certainly the opponents will say this costs too much, but they're going to say that anyway, no matter how much or how little it costs.
Yeah. I was curious, just since this is a Brown Alumni Club event, if there were any formative classes at Brown or any kind of experiences at Brown that were kind of the forerunner to what you're doing now.
Yeah, thank you for asking that. I haven't really thought about that until now. I think that when I started Brown, I thought that I was gonna learn to figure out the solutions of the world's problems. I really wanted to solve the world's problems, and I learned that pretty quickly that the solutions were already known, but they're not being implemented. And I took a class called Ethics in Public Policy with Professor Ross Chait, who I'm actually still in touch with. And there was this this book assigned in the class called The Social Control of Corporations. And it talked about, well, what if you had corporate boards have to have equal numbers of workers from the corporations as well as the shareholders? What if corporations were chartered in a way that they need to think more about their overall impact on their community, for example? So that was really an eye-opening for me, that there were specific structural things that could be done to shift power. So that led me to major in bioethics at Brown, looking at ethics to applied problems. I went to graduate school at UC Berkeley studying political psychology, how people think about moral and ethical issues. And then I worked as running a couple of technology companies for a while before starting MapLight. But this feels like the right fit for me now, actually, like trying to bring about political change, not just studying what the problems are, not just studying how people think about it, but actually, but those certainly proved as a lot of background for me to think about like how to actually get it done.
Yeah, I know also we chatted a little bit through email about the title of your book, which you came up with obviously probably a year ago or more.
Yeah.
And how do you feel like that term is being appropriated now?
Well, I think it's you know, certainly right. So Lisa pointed out, like, you have Republicans saying the election is rigged, and I think this term really it resonates for a lot of reasons. Like people, like there's pretty overwhelming consensus among people in the country about special interests controlling Washington, and that Washington works for big money and not for ordinary people. And that's true for Republicans and Democrats and independents. And in fact, when you think back to candidate Trump in 2016, he actually used a lot of those themes in his campaign as one of the things that propelled him forward. Bernie Sanders running in 2016 did the same thing. And you know, those are both indications of the political power of those those themes. So I think that I think I lost the thread here, but Yeah, the rigged theme. So so people feel the system is rigged, and you know it is rigged. You know, when you think rigged, it's like if you think of the definition of that term, if you think of like a rigged card game, like a rigged poker game. So two things are going on. First of all, it is set up there's a predetermined outcome. So somebody is dealing off the bottom of the deck, or they set up the cards in a certain way, so they're always going to get a good hand. So then it's set up. It doesn't seem like it's set up for a predetermined outcome from it is. The second thing about rigged is it is opaque. Right, so if you can see this is happening, that's different. But the card dealer is doing it in secret. So what do you have to do to unrig a poker game or unrig democracy? Number one, you have to show what's going on and show, well, this person's dealing off the bottom of the deck and they have the cards in the wrong way. But that is not enough to show it. You also have to change it and make sure that the deck is shuffled fairly. So I think it's a very appropriate word for our political system, because it seems like, whoa, it's a democracy in the sense that the people control what's going on and our government actually works for the people. But when you get right into it, like my first example about fresh fruit and school lunches, like that's actually not how decisions are getting made. And so that's the purpose of the unrigged term and why that's the title of the book, because we want to shine a light on it. And also we want to make it better. And it's true that other people use that language, and I think it's because people at some gut level understand, even if they don't know why this is happening, that they're getting screwed.
Do you have any idea how extensive this Koch funding of college courses is? And can you explain, like, how is it that they were underwriting a course at Brown?
So I'm going to flip to that section page in the book to reference the stat. So I don't know how it happened at Brown, but the Koch Foundation, which is one of the many institutions in this whole network, has to report its grantees, and so that's how I knew about Brown. So like $147,000 funded this professor, John Thomasy at Brown, literally hundreds of libertarian courses at universities, hundreds with the particular Koch ideology, which is extremely anti-government, extremely pro freedom of wealth ideology. And this is still going on today. Yeah, the other, another big academic influence pushed by the Koch network has been to get into law schools this doctrine called law and economics. So this was originally a fringe libertarian theory until one of the wealth hoarders spent hundreds of millions of dollars to start wealth and economics programs at Columbia and Yale and Harvard law schools. And so, and they would even pay students to take these classes. So this is over a period of years, really like pushing all of legal education to the right. The part of some of the wealth hoarders funded this program that went on for several decades of free vacations for judges, that 2 weeks at some tropical island, they would have seminars on why labor unions and economic regulation is bad for the economy and things like that. And then researchers showed that actually judges who participated in these seminars tended to rule more conservatively afterward. So this has been a long-term strategy. Again, they couldn't win at the ballot box in 1980 running a libertarian candidate. So like, well, we have the money and the will to try a lot of things and see what's successful. And as we see by our current politics in the country, some of their programs have been very successful. One of the central pillars of what the wealth hoarders have been pushing for is the ending of campaign finance rules. They achieved a dramatic victory in 2010 with the Citizens United Supreme Court decision and related court cases like the one called Speech Now. Together, this essentially removed restrictions, all restrictions on how much a person could spend, how much a corporation could spend, and it even allowed them to do the spending in secret. And so that's starting in 2010, you get a core of the Republican Party, especially nationally, unwilling to compromise. Like you could think of it as a Tea Party Republicans, but it's a bit more than that. So what does that mean if you don't compromise? Well, it means you really don't care if you shut down the government, right? You really don't care if you pass anything. So who does that serve? You think, well, this doesn't serve anybody, but it actually does. It serves these wealth hoarder people who don't want a functional government, because if there's no functional government, there's no regulation of wealth. When the Republicans were, after Donald Trump was elected in 2016 and the Republicans controlled the presidency and Congress, you didn't see like a ton of bills passed, right? But there's one major bill, which was this tax bill that dramatically decreased taxes for corporations and wealthy individuals, to the point where, as you may have seen, has been reported that the income group that pays the least percentage in taxes is the wealthiest 400 families in America right now, much more so than people earning like $15,000 a year or $100,000 a year. So this is a very clear, so the Republican Party now represents the wealth hoarders rather than Republican voters of the country as a whole. And this, people wonder, like, well, why is the Republican Party now is really different than it was like 30 years ago, but this is the reason why.
It actually goes back more than 30 years. It goes back to Goldwater. He really turned the party around and made it into a very, very conservative party. He lost the election, but he won the party.
Mm-hmm. In the book, I mentioned former Senator Orrin Hatch, very conservative senator for Utah. So back 20 years ago, he co-sponsored with Senator Ted Kennedy the Children's Health Insurance Program, but then in 2016, he voted for these giant tax cuts and said there's no money for the Children's Health Insurance Program. And so the reason he did that was because he was the Libertarians, the Koch network, ran a candidate against him in the primary who was even more extreme and anti-government. And Orrin Hatch realized, if I'm going to stay in office, I need to do what these people say. And that's an example of how it is for all these Republicans in Congress and other in the state legislatures as well. Either they toe the line because they're afraid of getting primaried, or they were elected with this extreme agenda. And that's been the money has been, and campaign finance, lack of regulation has been a critical lever in increasing the control over the party as well as the rest of the country.
I was curious if you think sort of the collective action and the grassroots action is the most important way, or like these sympathetic billionaires that someone mentioned earlier, can they be enlisted in the fight also against all this stuff?
I mean, it's both, and I think like the whole this is sort of a common phrase, but there's two sources of power there's organized money and organized people. And so you need collective action, right? So collective action can mean things like being on the streets, but there's lots of other equally important ways of collection action too. Now, many people are sympathetic, like some of the billionaires that have come up here, right? They see what's happening in the country and they want help, and they have money and resources. And throughout American history, social movements have received financial backing from wealthy people who sympathize, and that's true, the civil rights movement and today. And so that's great. We all have the resources and networks that we have, and it's all really important.
So,
sorry. Go ahead.
So while I was reading the book this weekend, I had a friend visiting from Seattle, and I talked about the democracy vouchers, of course. And his response was, I don't know what to do with my vouchers, and I don't know anybody who does. And I was wondering if you had any advice on how I could talk to a friend who had that kind of reaction.
Yeah, so I think I would suggest that, do they follow Seattle politics at all, and does that interest them? And I think sometimes you put $100 in coupons in the hands of someone, and maybe it makes them more interested, right? And not everybody, but which is okay. But the idea is it gives power to people, whether they're registered to vote or not, whether they follow politics or not. Someone could knock on your friend's door at some point and start talking to them, right? Engage them in kind of a grassroots way. And the fact that they have these vouchers, like they makes them someone who's worth talking to for the candidate.
So maybe the messaging there is a little bit about the effect that it has on the candidate's behavior, regardless of whether it inspires this individual who receives the democracy voucher to take any action himself. It still changes how the candidates in his city behave and how they run their campaigns.
Absolutely right. So if your friend, even if they're indifferent to using their voucher or following Seattle politics, they probably want people elected that are funded by the people and represent the people rather than like a narrow slice of the population or wealthy interests.
Thanks, that's helpful.
Yeah.
To kind of follow up on that, has there been any data about how many of these vouchers are actually utilized when?
Yeah, so there's only been 2 election cycles in Seattle, and it's a small minority of the vouchers that are actually used, but that's okay. That's kind of the point. Like you max out as a candidate, a city council candidate, at $300,000 in vouchers. But if everyone redeemed their vouchers, it would be in the millions and millions. Like the system is not designed to have everyone have to redeem it. It's that candidates who can gain grassroots support have the money that they need. So a candidate could go to this neighborhood or this group or any constituency that is like a real constituency that they can put together, and they will raise their $300,000. So there's many more vouchers mailed out than can actually be used. The nice thing is it has sort of a built-in marketing mechanism. Like everyone, including your friend, Karen, gets these vouchers in the mail. So it's like, well, what is this? And there's a bit of an education and like drawing people in. In Berkeley, where I live, we have a different model, which is any funds that you raise as a candidate up to $50 is matched 6 to 1 by a city fund. So you can ask somebody for $10 and then you get $60 in addition from the government. So that's also a really good system in making it possible for people to run. It doesn't have that built-in marketing component because most people in Berkeley have just never heard of it. So I think vouchers on the whole is like probably better overall, but like either system still serves the same goal.
You know, you focus your arguments about kind of the rich, greedy people, as it were, and yet when you look at where's the money come from, well, I think a majority of the money's come from corporations, not people. In national politics and even state politics.
I think it's individuals, and sometimes the line is pretty blurred. Like you have people who own corporations and they're donating. So I mean, if you look at like super PAC contributions, like typically individuals, but again, it's kind of a blurred line. Like Sheldon Adelson is one of the largest single donors to politics. I mean, owns casinos, right? So it's like, is it his businesses or him? I mean, it kind of melds together. You know, the Koch network is the same way. I mean, the Koch's, Charles Koch owns Koch Industries, which is this enormous company, worldwide company in also is a big fossil fuel producer, produces all sorts of chemicals, owns Georgia Pacific paper, like it's just an enormous company. And so his wealth comes from the company and his contributing serves the corporate interests.
And now with all of the stuff that's gone on since Citizens United, it's hard to know where the money's coming from.
Exactly. And the Citizens United decision, it's interesting. It didn't say that money had to be secret. It said that Congress and other governments can pass laws to make money transparent. And some states have done that. But the decision interacted with existing law to create these legal mechanisms like C4 and C6 nonprofit groups, LLCs, other ways, legal entities that can keep the money secret. Now, Congress could pass a law anytime they wanted to make this transparent. The Federal Election Commission could require transparency, but both those approaches have been disabled by Republicans who really want to keep things secret.
I know coming off of the presidential election, a lot of us are still thinking, have the whiplash regarding the effects of the Electoral College. And especially here in California, where we don't get the candidates coming out to campaign to our state, right? And in your book, I think you use the metaphor that the Electoral College is kind of like your appendix. Do we really need it anymore? Can you talk a little bit about, already thinking 4 years down the road, what we here in California might be able to do to affect change on that institution?
So the Electoral College, so there's two ways to change it. So one is a constitutional amendment to make the president elected by popular vote. That is a very difficult road because they're the swing states that benefit from the current system. They're not going to want that to change. There's another way to change it, which is called National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. And what that is an agreement between participating states. This agreement, which California has already passed into law as of about a dozen other states, says that we will award all of our electoral votes to the winner of the popular vote nationwide. But this only takes effect once enough other states have passed this law that it will actually make a difference in electing the president, right? So right now, there are about, 150 states representing roughly 150 electoral votes have passed this compact. And so this law sits on the books of these states like California, Colorado, New York, other states, and is dormant, it doesn't do anything. But once another 6 or 7 or 8 states pass this state law, then the next presidential election after that, all of these states will pay attention not to the people in their own state, but to the people in the country and look at who gets the most popular votes. And as a group, award all their states to the person who gets the most votes nationwide and make that person president. So that is like the way to do it without a constitutional amendment. Now, the way that would happen really quickly, or a constitutional amendment would happen quickly, is if a Democrat won the presidency without winning the popular vote, as almost happened with John Kerry. John Kerry came a 60,000 vote difference in Ohio would have let John Kerry win Ohio. He would have become president, despite the fact that George W. Bush received millions more votes from him nationwide. Now, the last couple, the examples like, with Trump and with Bush versus Gore election. So those things benefited the Republicans, even though the Democrat got more votes. And so the Republicans are very much like, we don't want to change the electoral college system. Like, it's working for us. But if you got a situation where it flipped, as it almost did in the Kerry Bush election, then you would see this very broad national consensus, like, we need to change this messed up system.
Interesting. Okay. We'll have to see if a candidate like that surfaces. Great. Well, are there any other questions here for Dan? I'm sure he's willing to follow up with you.
Yeah, I'll chat my my email address, dan@maplight.org, and on the website unrigbook.com, there's a list of groups to get involved as well. But yeah, it's so nice to be here with all of you, and yeah, and it's a really engaging and fun discussion. I appreciate it.
Yeah, and once again, really appreciate people being on Zoom at the end of the day and discussing this topic after a year's worth of intense political climate. So, and more to come. So really appreciate that. And yeah, if there are any further questions, we'll finish up. And hopefully, if you're interested in any more of our events from the Brown Alumni Club of Greater San Francisco, please check out our website. We're still pretty active, doing about 3 or 4 events per month. And we're going to have a holidazzle event in December with an alum who, one of our alums, class of 09, is a professional magician. So check that out in our newsletter. But thanks everyone, and hope you have a really good night. Thanks for coming.
Thank you all.